The patrol never came back. 7 soldiers and a lieutenant, riding north through the Medicine Bow country on a cold November morning in 1883, and only silence followed. When the search party found them 3 days later, scattered across a mile of open ground, each man had been shot from a distance no one thought possible. The army sent investigators. The newspapers printed theories. But no one could explain how a single rifle, fired by a hand no one ever saw, could have done what it did that day. And no one could say why the man who held it let one soldier live. Some said it was the work of a ghost. Others called it an execution. But in the years that followed, when the wind moved through those hills and the light fell wrong across the sagebrush, even the men who'd worn the uniform avoided that stretch of country. They said the land remembered. They said the shots still echoed if you listened close enough. In the autumn of 1883, Fort Halleck sat low and weathered against the Wyoming plains like a scar that wouldn't heal. It was not a large installation, nor a proud one. The wood had gone gray from years of wind and snow. The parade ground was hard-packed dirt crossed with wagon ruts and the stains of old fires. 23 soldiers were garrisoned there, most of them young, most of them counting days until their enlistments ran dry. The Indian Wars had cooled in that part of the territory, and what remained was the slow, unglamorous work of keeping order in a place where order had never really taken root. Lieutenant Jacob Howell had been stationed at Halleck for 11 months. He was 31 years old, clean-shaven, soft-spoken, and careful in the way men become when they've seen authority misused. He kept a small leather journal in his coat pocket and wrote in it most nights by candlelight, though he never showed it to anyone. He had joined the army after the war back east, looking for structure, looking for purpose. What he'd found instead was distance. Distance from the men he commanded, distance from the settlers he was meant to protect, and distance from the decisions that came down from officers who had never ridden the country they governed. Howell's patrol was a routine affair, at least on paper. A rancher named Cyrus Leland had reported missing cattle and signs of movement near his northern range, close to the edge of the Wind River country. It wasn't unusual. Cattle went missing all the time, stolen by drifters or lost to weather. But Leland had also mentioned something else in his letter to the fort, something the post commander had read aloud with a faint note of skepticism. He'd said his hired men had seen smoke on the ridges at night, and that his horses had grown uneasy. He'd said it felt like someone was watching. Howell had been ordered to take a small detachment north, assess the situation, and report back. 7 men, 3 days, maybe 4. He chose soldiers he trusted to ride quietly and follow orders without complaint. Corporal Samuel Drexler, a thick-shouldered man from Pennsylvania who never smiled but never shirked. Private William Moss, barely 19, who wrote letters home to his mother every Sunday. Private Amos Tull, a Kentucky boy with a scar across his knuckles and a talent for tracking. And 4 others, steady men, unexceptional but reliable. They left the fort on the morning of November 9th, under a sky the color of tin. The ride north took them through open country, rolling hills broken by clusters of juniper and sage, and long stretches where the land seemed to flatten into nothing. The air was cold but not yet bitter, and the wind carried the faint smell of sage and dust. Howell rode at the front, his Springfield rifle balanced across his saddle. He did not speak much, and the men were content to follow in silence. They passed a few scattered homesteads, small cabins set back from the trail with thin columns of smoke rising from stone chimneys. A woman hanging laundry paused to watch them ride by, her hand still on the line, her face unreadable. By midday, they reached the edge of Leland's range. The land here was rougher, cut by dry creek beds and low ridges crowned with pine. Howell called a halt near a stand of cottonwoods and told the men to water the horses. Corporal Drexler dismounted and walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the hills to the west. He didn't like the look of the country. Too many places for someone to sit and watch without being seen. Howell nodded. He'd learned to trust Drexler's instincts. The man had fought Apache in Arizona before transferring north, and he had the kind of caution that kept men alive. Howell turned and looked back at the patrol. The soldiers were quiet, efficient. Moss was checking his saddle straps. Tull was kneeling by the creek, cupping water in his hands. Drexler glanced at him. Leland's ranch was a modest operation, a low-roofed house and a barn set against the base of a timbered ridge. Corrals stretched out to the east, empty now except for a few horses standing with their heads low. When the patrol rode in, Leland came out onto the porch, a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. He was a man in his 50s, sun-scorched and lean, with the kind of face that had learned not to expect much from the world. "Lieutenant," Leland said, nodding. "Mr. Leland," Howell replied, dismounting. Howell studied him. 3 head, maybe 4, hard to say. They're scattered up in the hills, but it's not the cattle I'm worried about. He gestured toward the ridge behind the house. 2 nights ago, my foreman rode up there to check the line shack, said he found boot prints near the spring. Could be a drifter, Howell said. Could be. Leland's eyes didn't leave the ridge, but a drifter don't usually take the time to cover his tracks. Not seen, felt. Leland shifted the rifle in his arms. You ever get the sense you're being measured, Lieutenant? Leland nodded slowly. Welcome to camp in the barn. As the soldiers unsaddled their horses and settled in, Howell stood at the edge of the corral and looked up at the ridge. The sun was sinking behind it now, casting long shadows through the pines. That night the wind picked up. It moved through the trees on the ridge with a low, steady sound like distant water. The soldiers ate quietly in the barn, tin plates balanced on their knees, and afterward some of them played cards by lantern light while others stretched out on bedrolls and tried to sleep. Howell sat near the open door, his journal resting on his knee, but he didn't write. He watched the darkness beyond the corral and listened. Around midnight, one of the horses began to pace. Then another. Howell stood and walked out into the cold. The animals were restless, their ears pricked toward the ridge. He could see nothing up there, no movement, no light. Drexler didn't question it. He turned and went back into the barn. A few minutes later, 2 soldiers took up positions near the corral, rifles in hand. Howell remained where he was, standing in the cold with his breath misting in front of him. He thought about the boot prints by the spring, the covered fire ring. Morning came gray and cold. Howell gathered the patrol and told them they'd be riding up to the ridge to investigate. Leland's foreman, a wiry man named Pickett, offered to guide them to the spring. Howell accepted. They left 2 men behind to watch the horses and set out on foot, climbing through the pines as the light grew pale and thin around them. The spring was a 1/4 mile up the slope, a small seep surrounded by moss-covered stones and the skeletal remains of an old fence. Pickett pointed out the boot prints, still visible in the soft ground near the water. Howell knelt and studied them. They were deliberate, evenly spaced. The kind of tracks left by someone who knew how to move quietly. Nearby, hidden beneath a scattering of pine needles, was the fire ring. Howell brushed the needles aside and saw the ash underneath, cold but not old. He was here 2 days ago, Tull said, crouching beside him. Howell stood and scanned the ridge above them. There were dozens of places where a man could sit and see the ranch below, dozens of places to hide. Spread out, he said. Look for more sign. The soldiers moved through the trees, slow and methodical. Howell stayed near the spring, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The wind had died, and the silence felt heavy, expectant. He thought about the letter Leland had written. Howell climbed toward him, Drexler and Tull following close behind. Moss was standing beside a flat-topped boulder, his face pale. On the surface of the rock, someone had carved a series of marks, not words, symbols, lines and circles arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to Howell but felt deliberate, intentional. "What is that?" Moss asked quietly. No one spoke as they made their way back down the ridge. The numbers sat in Howell's mind like a weight, heavy and cold. Howell shook his head. Leland looked past him toward the ridge. 4 years ago, there was a patrol that came through here, army boys like you. They were looking for a deserter, some fellow who'd gone missing from a fort down south. They camped near my land for a few days, asked questions, then moved on. Leland frowned, thinking. No, but I remember one of the soldiers saying he'd killed an officer before he ran. Howell looked at Drexler. The corporal's face was unreadable. "We'll report this to the fort," Howell said. But even as he said it, he knew they wouldn't make it back to the fort, not all of them. Because that night, as the patrol prepared to leave at first light, the wind came back. And with it, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, closer. And when Howell stood at the edge of the firelight and looked up at the ridge, he saw it. A single point of light, high among the trees, not a campfire. Too small, too focused. It flickered once, then vanished. Someone was up there, and they had a rifle. Howell gave the order to break camp before dawn. The soldiers moved quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, rolling their bedrolls with numb fingers, checking saddle straps by the light of a single lantern. No one mentioned the light they'd seen on the ridge the night before, but it hung between them like a held breath. Leland stood on his porch as they prepared to leave, his rifle still cradled in his arms, his eyes following the tree line above his ranch. "You're riding out?" he asked when Howell came to settle accounts. "We've seen what we came to see," Howell replied. "I'll file a report when we get back to the fort." Leland nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he didn't believe a larger patrol would make any difference. "You be careful out there, Lieutenant. Whatever's up in those trees, it's been patient this long." Howell didn't disagree. He shook Leland's hand and mounted his horse. The patrol formed up in a loose column, 7 soldiers and 1 officer, their breath misting in the cold air. As they rode away from the ranch, Howell glanced back once at the ridge. The trees stood black against the lightening sky, silent and still. If someone was watching them leave, he couldn't see them. But he felt it, that same weight Leland had described, the sense of being measured. They rode south through the Medicine Bow country, following the trail they'd taken on the way in. The land opened up around them, wide and empty, the kind of terrain where a man could see for miles in every direction. It should have felt safe. It didn't. Howell kept the patrol moving at a steady pace, not hurrying but not lingering either. Drexler rode near the front, his eyes scanning the ridges to either side. Tull brought up the rear, watching their back trail. The younger soldiers stayed quiet, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. Fort Halleck received word of the missing patrol on the 5th day. When Lieutenant Howell failed to report back on schedule, the post commander sent a rider to Leland's ranch. The rancher told him the patrol had left on the morning of November 12th, heading south toward the fort. The rider returned with that news, and the commander ordered an immediate search. 20 men rode out under Captain Raymond Blythe, a career officer with gray in his beard and a reputation for thoroughness. They found the first body just after noon on the 2nd day of searching. Private William Moss, the boy who wrote letters to his mother every Sunday, lay in a shallow draw half a mile from the main trail. The soldiers who found him called for the captain, and Blythe dismounted to examine the scene. There was no sign of a struggle. No tracks nearby except those of Moss's horse, which they found grazing a quarter-mile away, still saddled. The young soldier appeared to have simply fallen, as if struck by something he never saw coming. Blythe studied the surrounding terrain. The nearest cover was a stand of rocks 300 yards to the west, elevated above the draw. It would have been a difficult placement for a rifle, but not impossible. He ordered his men to spread out and search for the others. By nightfall, they had found 4 more. Each man discovered alone, separated from the others by distances that made no tactical sense. Private Amos Tull was found near a dry creek bed. Two others lay on opposite sides of a low ridge. Corporal Drexler's body was located almost a mile from the rest, sprawled beside his horse at the base of a rock formation. None of the horses had been taken. None of the men had been robbed. Their weapons remained with them, unfired. It was the pattern that unsettled Blythe most. The spacing suggested the patrol had been broken apart deliberately, each man isolated and dealt with in turn. But there were no tracks to indicate how it had been done, no evidence of a pursuing force, no empty cartridge casings to mark where the attacker had positioned himself. It was as if something had reached down from the sky and plucked them away one by one. They found Lieutenant Howell last, just before dark on the third day. He was sitting against a cottonwood tree near the remnants of a cold campfire, his journal still clutched in one hand. His Springfield rifle lay across his knees, unused. Captain Blythe approached slowly, his own rifle ready, but there was no need. Howell had been gone for at least 2 days. Blythe knelt and gently removed the journal from the dead man's grip. He opened it carefully, turning to the last entry. The handwriting was steady, controlled, written by lamplight in what must have been the final hours before dawn. * November 13, 1883. We are being followed. I am certain of it now. The men feel it too, though none have spoken the words aloud. Drexler wants to push hard for the fort, but I fear that would only separate us further. We will camp here tonight and keep watch in shifts. If we do not make it back, whoever reads this should know that we did not die from accident or misfortune. Blythe closed the journal and looked around at the campsite. The fire had been carefully built, the bedrolls laid out in a defensive circle. It looked like a camp made by men who expected trouble. But it hadn't been enough. One of his soldiers called out from the tree line. Blythe rose and walked over. The investigation that followed consumed the better part of 2 months. Army officials came up from Cheyenne and Denver. A federal marshal named Garrett was dispatched to oversee the inquiry. Interviews were conducted with every rancher, every homesteader, every drifter who'd been within 50 miles of the Medicine Bow country that November. Newspapers in Laramie and Rawlins printed urgent appeals for information. Rewards were posted. Telegraph lines carried descriptions of possible suspects up and down the territory. But the more they searched, the less they found. No one had seen a stranger in those hills during the relevant days. No one reported hearing rifle fire. The few tracks that searchers managed to locate led nowhere, disappearing into rock fields or creek beds, or simply ending in the middle of open ground, as if the person who made them had learned to walk without touching the earth. The numbers carved into the tree became the focus of much speculation. Marshal Garrett spent weeks combing through Army records, looking for any event or incident tied to the year 1879. He found dozens of entries: desertions, disciplinary actions, courts-martial, skirmishes with outlaws and displaced tribes. But none of them seemed to connect directly to Fort Halleck or to the men who had died. One lead did emerge, faint and fragmentary. A clerk at the Territorial Archives in Cheyenne uncovered a requisition order from the spring of 1879, requesting additional men and supplies for a manhunt in the southeastern part of Wyoming. The target was listed only as Private E. Coulter, deserter, armed and dangerous. The order noted that Coulter had been involved in an altercation at Fort Russell that resulted in the death of a senior officer. He was to be apprehended by any means necessary, but the file contained no follow-up reports, no confirmation of capture. No record of a trial or execution. The manhunt simply ended, its conclusion unwritten, as if someone had closed the book before the final chapter. Marshal Garrett brought the documents to Captain Blythe. They sat together in the captain's office at Fort Halleck, the winter wind rattling the windows, and studied the yellowed pages by lamplight. "You think this Coulter is still out there?" Blythe asked. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his face lined with exhaustion. Or both, Blythe said quietly. Even if it is him, Garrett continued, proving it is another matter. We have no witnesses. Blythe looked down at the journal Lieutenant Howell had kept, which now lay on his desk. He had read it cover to cover 3 times, searching for anything he might have missed. Deserters don't usually come back, Garrett replied. They run and keep running. But if Coulter had reason to believe the army was still looking for him, if he thought that patrol was sent specifically for him, he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Then he made sure they wouldn't report back, Blythe finished. Garrett nodded slowly. It's a theory. The investigation continued through the winter, but as the snow piled up and the temperatures dropped, the urgency began to fade. The soldiers who had died were buried with military honors. Their families were notified. Compensation was arranged. And slowly, inevitably, the case became just another file in a cabinet, just another unsolved mystery in a territory full of them. But the story didn't die. It simply changed shape. In the years that followed, the Medicine Bow country took on a different character in the minds of those who lived nearby. Ranchers avoided the northern ranges, claiming the grass wasn't good enough to justify the risk. Trappers who once worked the high ridges moved their operations south. Even the Shoshone and Arapaho, whose people had walked that land for generations, began to speak of it with unease, saying the hills had grown quiet, that the animals no longer moved through them as they once had. Stories spread, passed from campfire to saloon to Sunday dinner table. Some said the marksman had been a soldier wronged by his own officers, a man driven to madness by injustice. Others claimed he was a widower who'd lost his family to a cavalry raid and had sworn vengeance against any man in uniform. There were those who insisted he wasn't alone, that he was part of a group of deserters living in the high country, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again. Sightings were reported, though none were ever confirmed. A sheepherder near the Sweetwater River claimed he'd seen smoke rising from a canyon where no one lived. A family traveling through the region said their horses had spooked one evening, and when the father went to investigate, he found boot prints circling their camp. A miner swore he'd heard a single rifle shot echo through the mountains, impossibly distant, impossibly precise. Each story added another layer to the legend. And with each telling, the marksman became less a man and more a presence, something that existed in the space between rumor and reality, fear and fact. In the town of Medicine Bow itself, the incident became a touchstone for a certain kind of conversation. Old-timers spoke of it when they wanted to remind newcomers that the land was not as settled as it seemed. Mothers invoked it when warning their children not to wander too far from home. And once a year, on the anniversary of the patrol's disappearance, someone would raise a glass in the saloon and offer a quiet toast to the men who hadn't come back. But as the years passed, the people who remembered the details began to thin out. Captain Blythe retired and moved back east. Marshal Garrett took another assignment and was eventually lost to a fever in Colorado. The soldiers who had found the bodies were reassigned, scattered across the West, and their memories blurred with distance and time. Even Cyrus Leland, the rancher who had first written to the fort, sold his land in 1891 and moved to Oregon, unwilling to spend another winter looking up at that ridge. By the turn of the century, the case had become a footnote, a curiosity for history enthusiasts and amateur detectives. Occasionally, a journalist would write an article about the unsolved deaths, or a lecturer would include the story in a talk about frontier violence. But there were no new leads, no discoveries, just the slow, steady accumulation of dust on old files. A surveying crew working for the Bureau of Land Management was mapping the boundaries of what would eventually become part of the Medicine Bow National Forest. They were up in the high country, miles from the nearest road, when one of the men noticed something unusual. Wedged into a crevice between 2 rocks, protected from the weather by an overhang, was a leather satchel. The crew chief, a man named Harlan Wells, pulled it free and brushed off the dirt. The leather was cracked and faded but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several items: a small notebook filled with precise handwriting, a pocket watch with an engraving on the back, a folded map of southeastern Wyoming, and a photograph, faded but still legible, showing a young man in an army uniform standing beside a woman in a simple dress. Wells brought the satchel down to the ranger station and handed it over to the authorities. Within a week, it had been forwarded to the State Historical Society in Cheyenne, where an archivist named Dorothy Brennan began the slow work of identifying its contents. The notebook proved to be a journal, similar in style to the one Lieutenant Howell had kept. But this one belonged to someone else. The entries were sparse, written in short, clipped sentences that suggested either haste or discipline. Most were dated between 1879 and 1881. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the work of someone who valued precision. Brennan read through the pages carefully, making notes as she went. The journal spoke of long stretches of solitude, of hunting and trapping, of moving camp every few weeks to avoid detection. There were references to the officers and the search parties, always written with a kind of detached observation, as if the writer were studying insects rather than describing men who wanted him dead. One entry, dated April 1879, caught her attention. "They do not understand that I will not go back. They believe all men can be broken, that fear or hunger or cold will drive any deserter to surrender. But I have learned to live on less than they can imagine. I have learned to be still." Another entry, written nearly 2 years later, was shorter but more direct. Asterisk saw patrol moving through the lower valley today. 8 men. They rode in formation, rifles out, eyes forward. Brennan turned to the photograph next. The man in uniform was young, perhaps mid-20s, with a serious face and dark eyes. The pocket watch was engraved with initials, ECN beneath them, a single word. Brennan spent the next several days cross-referencing the journal entries with historical records. She found references to desertions, to manhunts, to patrols that had gone missing. And eventually, she found the name, Private Emmett Coulter, enlisted in 1876, stationed at Fort Russell. Charged with the death of a superior officer in March 1879 after a dispute over treatment of prisoners. Escaped custody before trial. Declared a fugitive. Last seen heading northwest into the mountains. The manhunt for Coulter had lasted 3 months before being quietly abandoned. No body had been found. No confirmed sightings. He had simply disappeared into the wilderness, taking with him whatever skills and knowledge had allowed him to survive alone in some of the harshest country on the continent. Brennan compiled her findings into a report and forwarded it to the state attorney general's office. A brief inquiry was opened, though by 1923 there was little appetite for revisiting a case from 40 years prior. Most of the people involved were dead. The few who remained had no memory of the specifics, and without a body, without a living witness, there was no crime to prosecute. But the discovery reignited interest in the story. Newspapers ran articles about the journal and the satchel. Historians debated whether Private Coulter had indeed been responsible for the deaths of Lieutenant Howell and his men. Some argued the evidence was circumstantial at best, that the journal proved only that Coulter had been in the region, not that he had taken action. Others pointed to the tone of the entries, the cold assessment of the patrols, the implicit threat in his words. Dorothy Brennan, for her part, believed the answer lay not in what the journal said, but in what it didn't say. There were no entries after 1881. No explanation for why the journal had been hidden rather than kept, and no indication of what had happened to Emmett Coulter after he placed that satchel in the rocks and walked away. She stood in the archive one evening, long after the other staff had gone home, and reread the final entry in the journal. It was dated November 1881, 2 years before the patrol had disappeared. I have decided that silence is the only language they will understand, not threats, not warnings. Brennan closed the journal and placed it back in its protective case. Outside, the sun was setting over Cheyenne, casting long shadows across the streets. She thought about the man who had written those words, about the years he must have spent alone in the mountains, about the decision he had made to step outside the boundaries of law and civilization and become something else entirely. She thought about the 7 soldiers who had died in 1883, and about the lieutenant who had written in his own journal that they were being hunted. And she thought about the one soldier from that patrol who had survived, the man no one ever talked about, the one who had been found wandering near the fort 3 days after the others disappeared, unable to speak, his eyes empty. No one had ever gotten a coherent account from him. He'd been discharged on medical grounds and had disappeared into obscurity. But before he left, he'd said one thing to the doctor who examined him, a single sentence that had been noted in the medical file and then forgotten. Brennan had found that file earlier in the week, buried in a box of old military records. She had read the sentence 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. And now, standing alone in the archive with Coulter's journal in front of her, she thought she finally did. The marksman hadn't wanted to kill them all. He'd wanted to send a message that said he was still out there, that he was watching, that the land had not given him up and never would. She looked down at the photograph one more time at the young man in uniform and the woman beside him. Asterisk before everything, the inscription read, before the dispute, before the escape, before the long years in the wilderness, before he became the thing they feared. Brennan wondered if anyone had ever found out what happened to the woman in the photograph, if she'd waited for him, if she'd known what he'd become. But like so many other questions surrounding Emmett Coulter, that one had no answer, only the silence, and the endless empty hills. The woman who came to Cheyenne in the spring of 1924 was not what anyone expected. She arrived on the afternoon train from Denver, carrying a single carpetbag and wearing a gray dress that had been mended more than once. Her name was Catherine Merrick, though the marriage certificate she presented to Dorothy Brennan showed that she had once been Catherine Coulter. She was 68 years old, and her hands shook slightly as she set the carpetbag on the archive table. Brennan had been cataloging a collection of territorial land surveys when the woman walked in. Now, she set down her pen and studied the visitor's face. There was something in it that spoke of years spent waiting, of questions held so long they had become part of the person holding them. His wife, Brennan said. It wasn't a question, Catherine nodded. I was, though I don't know if the law would recognize it anymore. No, Catherine sat down slowly, as if the weight of the journey had finally caught up with her. I kept thinking he might come back, or that someone would bring me news, but there was only silence. I want to know if it was him, Catherine said. If he really did what they say he did, the soldiers who died the patrol. Brennan opened the drawer where she kept the journal and the photograph. She placed them on the table between them. Catherine's eyes went to the photograph immediately. What happened? Brennan asked. Catherine pulled her hand back and folded it with the other in her lap. Emmett wasn't like the other soldiers. He thought too much, saw too much. When they brought prisoners back to the fort, men they'd arrested for stealing or trespassing, he couldn't stand the way they were treated. He spoke up once, and his captain told him to keep quiet. He spoke up again, and they put him on latrine duty for a month. He did. Catherine's voice was steady but quiet. The major was drunk. He had no choice. They were going to hang him. Self-defense didn't matter when the dead man wore officers' bars. She looked down at her hands. He came to our quarters in the middle of the night, told me what had happened, said he was leaving and that I shouldn't wait for him. I told him I would wait as long as it took. Once, Catherine said, 6 months after he left, A letter came, no return address, postmarked from somewhere in Colorado. It wasn't long. He said he was alive. Nothing. Just years. I waited in Wyoming for as long as I could, thinking maybe he'd find a way to come back. But the army kept searching, and I knew as long as they were looking, he couldn't risk it. So I moved to Denver, found work as a seamstress. Built a life that felt like waiting without looking like it. She reached out and finally touched the photograph, her fingertips resting on the image of the young man in uniform. I always hoped he found peace. Catherine took the journal and read the passage Brennan indicated. It was dated September 1880. Asterisk, I saw a hawk today, hunting in the valley below my camp. It circled for an hour, patient and still, waiting for the right moment. When it finally dove, the movement was so fast I almost missed it, precision born from necessity. I have learned to hunt the same way. Catherine closed the journal and set it down. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. That's him, she said. Do you think he killed those soldiers? Brennan asked gently. Catherine was quiet for a long time. Outside the archive window, the afternoon sun slanted through the glass, casting geometric shadows across the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 45 years. I think he did, she said. Not because he wanted to, but because they came looking for him and he couldn't let them take him back. He'd spent too long learning to survive. No, Catherine shook her head, but I don't think he believed in right and wrong anymore. Brennan thought about the question carefully before answering. I think it makes you human, she said. Catherine nodded slowly. She reached into her carpetbag and pulled out a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. These are the letters I wrote to him over the years. I kept writing even after I knew he'd never read them. I thought maybe someday someone would find them, and they'd understand that he wasn't just the man in the stories, that he was someone's husband, someone's choice. She set the bundle on the table beside the journal. Thank you. Catherine stood slowly, gathering her carpetbag. I don't expect the army will ever admit what they did to drive him into those mountains, and I don't expect anyone will ever find where he went after he left that journal. She walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Miss Brennan, if you ever find out what happened to him, where he ended up, I'd like to know, even if it's years from now. I'll try, Brennan promised. Catherine nodded once, then stepped out into the spring afternoon. Brennan watched her go, a small figure in gray disappearing into the streets of Cheyenne, carrying 45 years of waiting with the same quiet dignity she'd brought through the door. The letters Catherine Merrick left behind became part of the official archive, cataloged and stored alongside Emmett Coulter's journal and belongings. Brennan read through them over the following weeks, and what she found was a portrait of devotion that refused to diminish with time. The early letters were full of hope, asking questions about his health and safety, making plans for a future reunion. The later ones grew more philosophical, more resigned, but no less loving. Catherine wrote about the seasons changing, about the work she did, about the small moments of beauty she encountered and wished she could share with him. One letter, written in 1895, 16 years after he disappeared, contained a passage that Brennan copied into her own notes. I saw a man today who walked like you used to walk, with that same careful awareness, as if he were always listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. For just a moment I thought it was you. My heart stopped, and I almost called out. But then he turned, and his face was a stranger's face, and I remembered all over again that you're gone. I don't know if you're alive out there somewhere, or if the mountains took you years ago, but I want you to know that I never stopped looking for you in crowds. Brennan set the letter down and looked out her office window at the mountains visible in the distance. She thought about a man living in those peaks for years, watching patrols pass below, making the calculations that kept him alive and free. She thought about the terrible mathematics of survival, The way one choice led to another until the person making them became unrecognizable even to themselves. The state's inquiry into Coulter's case concluded without resolution. There was no evidence sufficient to declare him officially responsible for the deaths in 1883, and there was no body to confirm his own death. The file was marked as closed but unresolved, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that some questions outlive the people who ask them. But the story continued to circulate, passed along by historians and writers fascinated by its gaps and silences. The Medicine Bow country remained largely unsettled, designated eventually as federal land where the trees grew thick and the ridges stood empty. Hikers who ventured into that territory sometimes reported finding old campsites, fire rings buried under decades of pine needles, carved marks on trees whose meanings had been lost to time. Whether any of them had belonged to Emmett Coulter, no one could say. In 1956, a sheepherder named Thomas Beale found a skeleton in a cave high above the North Platte River. The cave was remote, accessible only by a steep climb through loose rock and deadfall timber. The bones were scattered, disturbed by animals over the years, but enough remained to suggest a man of average height who had died sometime in the distant past. Beside the skeleton was a rusted rifle, its wooden stock rotted away, and the remnants of a leather belt with a buckle bearing the insignia of the U.S. Army. Beale reported the find to the county sheriff, who arranged for the bones to be transported to the state medical examiner. But by then, so many years had passed, and so many records had been lost that identifying the remains proved impossible. The skeleton was buried in an unmarked grave in a Cheyenne cemetery, one more anonymous soul added to the long list of those who'd come west and never found their way back. Dorothy Brennan, retired by then and living quietly in a small house near the Capitol, read about the discovery in the newspaper. She made a phone call to the sheriff's office and asked about the details, where exactly the cave had been located, what condition the rifle was in, whether anything else had been found nearby. The answers were vague, second-hand, filtered through people who didn't understand why an elderly archivist would care about old bones in a forgotten cave. She never said publicly what she suspected. But a month after the skeleton was buried, she visited the cemetery and placed a small bunch of wildflowers on the unmarked grave. She stood there for a long time in the autumn wind, thinking about a young soldier and the woman who'd loved him, about choices made in anger and desperation, about the long silence that had followed. Before she left, she whispered a few words, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Whether the bones in that grave belonged to Emmett Coulter or to some other forgotten wanderer, no one would ever know for certain. Years turned into decades. The people who had lived through the original events passed away one by one. The ranches changed hands. The fort was decommissioned and eventually torn down. The soldiers who'd searched for Coulter's trail became names in record books, then faded even from those. The Medicine Bow country remained, indifferent to the stories told about it, the grass and sagebrush growing over the places where men had once ridden and died and disappeared. But in certain families, the story persisted. A grandson of one of the soldiers killed in 1883 made it his hobby to collect every scrap of information he could find, filling boxes with photocopied reports and newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. A distant cousin of Catherine Merrick wrote a slim volume about her life, published by a small press in Colorado, detailing her quiet dignity and her long years of waiting. Local historians in Wyoming occasionally gave talks about the unsolved case, presenting the known facts and inviting audiences to draw their own conclusions. The truth, such as it was, remained scattered across decades and distances. No single document held all the answers. No confession was ever signed. The best anyone could do was gather the pieces and try to see the shape they made when held up to the light. What seemed certain was that Emmett Coulter had lived alone in the mountains for at least several years after his desertion, that he had become skilled enough to avoid detection by multiple search parties, that he had, at some point, encountered the patrol led by Lieutenant Howell and decided they posed a threat he could not ignore, and that afterward, he had vanished so completely that even the land itself seemed to have swallowed him whole. What could never be known was what he thought in those final years, whether he felt remorse or justification, whether he dreamed of the woman he'd left behind or had taught himself to stop dreaming altogether. The journal had ended in 1881, and the man who wrote it had left no other words. His silence was complete, unyielding, a locked door that time could not open. In the end, perhaps that was the only answer the story could offer. Not resolution, but the acknowledgement that some men step so far outside the boundaries of law and society that they become impossible to retrieve, even in memory. They become legends, warnings, mysteries that people tell each other when the night grows cold and the fire burns low. And in the telling, they become less than they were and more than they were, both diminished and enlarged by the absence of truth. On a summer evening in 1998, a group of hikers camping in the Medicine Bow National Forest sat around their fire, and one of them told the story of the phantom marksman, the deserter who'd killed a patrol and disappeared. The details were garbled, the names forgotten, but the shape of the tale remained. A lone man in the mountains, soldiers sent to find him, a reckoning that left only questions. One of the hikers, a woman in her 30s who taught history at a college in Laramie, listened quietly and then added what she knew from her research: the journal, the wife who'd waited, the bones that might or might not have been his. The others listened, and when she finished, no one spoke for a while. Finally, the youngest among them, a teenager visiting from back east, asked the question they were all thinking. The history teacher considered this carefully, watching the firelight flicker across the faces around her. I think he was a person who made choices that seemed necessary at the time. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkness. Above them, the stars were thick and bright, the same stars that had looked down on Emmett Coulter and Lieutenant Howell, and all the others who'd passed through this country carrying their own private wars. The woman looked up at those stars and thought about Catherine Merrick, who'd spent her whole life waiting for a man who never came home, about Dorothy Brennan, who'd preserved the fragments so that someone, someday, might understand. The fire burned lower, the night deepened, and the Medicine Bow country stretched away into the darkness, keeping its secrets as it always had, as it always would, patient and silent, and unmoved by the brief, bright passage of human lives across its face. Somewhere in those hills, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. And if you listened closely enough, if you knew what to listen for, you might almost hear the echo of old footsteps, fading but never quite gone, walking a trail only they could see toward a horizon that remained forever out of reach.